Well, hello, History 573 students. This is your mini lecture on the Mexican Revolution, since some of you out there may not be familiar with the Mexican Revolution. So you'll be reading a lot of things starting right off from the first week, because this is a summer class. So this is meant to give you a little orientation. A few of you will have already known this story from previous classes here at Texas A&M Commerce. I just want to give you all who don't know much about the Mexican Revolution a little background. My name is Dr. Mark Moreno, and my research specialty is 19th century Mexico, more specifically popular culture, print culture, and primary education. But I do like to lecture about the Mexican Revolution, and I've studied a lot about the Mexican Revolution. And so to take you sort of back, we can start back a little bit before 1910. And before I go on, I do want to mention that at the end of our talk here, I will be talking about our assignments for the summer. There's a few adaptations I have to make on the D2L as far as the assignments, but I think you all have an idea of the assignments based on what's on the syllabus, and I will talk about that briefly before we sign out here. So here we go with the Mexican Revolution. Okay, the story. Let's stretch back a little bit to the middle of the 19th century. You know, every story in history has a very long beginning. And two individuals here you see on your right, Benito Juarez, one of the very first purely indigenous presidents in Latin America, or all of the Americas, pure-blooded indigenous man from Oaxaca, Mexico, rose to be the president of Mexico and the leader of what's called the liberal faction of Mexican politics going into the mid-19th century. The man on your left is Porfirio Diaz, who under Juarez was probably the most respected military officer who led the resistance against the French occupation that began starting in 1862 with, and I'll skip over some of these. You don't need to know these right now. The Battle of Puebla, known to you as Cinco de Mayo, where people like to drink and things like that. But it was an actual invasion of Mexico by French military forces on May 5th, 1862, which was defeated. What they don't tell you was that the rest of the story was that the French returned a year later with 30,000 soldiers, one of the largest land forces of invasion in the 19th century, overrunning Mexico City, the capital, and almost every other capital of the Mexican states, forcing Juarez and the liberals that were in Mexico City to flee north to avoid capture and possible execution. Porfirio Diaz returned to the home state of Oaxaca to gather up his forces there. He eventually was defeated by the French and made a prisoner of war before escaping to reorganize his resistance forces. It's a little bit of a complicated story, yes it is. The other part of this story is Mexican conservatives who favored a monarchy were the ones who now controlled Mexico City with the help of the French army, and their choice for the leader of Mexico was an Austrian Archduke named Maximilian, and there his lovely wife Charlotte, or as she became known in Mexico as Carlota. The Maximilian was the third heir to the Austrian throne, had to renounce all of his rights to the throne when he became the Emperor of Mexico. Charlotte, or Carlota, was the daughter of Leopold I, the first king of Belgium, and the sister of Leopold II of the infamous Congo era, or the infamous Belgian Congo era, where her brother was engaged in actual slave trade in the Congo. That's one of the backdrops to this story. Anyway, the Emperor Maximilian and his Empress Carlota were the Emperor and Empress of Mexico from 1864 to 1867, with the help of the French military, and their allies were the Mexican conservatives, who actually effectively controlled the government with Maximilian as a figurehead. Maximilian and the Mexican conservatives rarely got along, and so there was already some instability within that government, which was in effect the power in Mexico at the time, with Juarez and the liberals, who wanted to establish a Mexican republic, having to flee the government seat of Mexico City and head north, while various guerrilla groups in the various states fought against the French and the Mexican conservative troops. They eventually were defeated. And we can skip all of this other interesting story. I can show you this some other time. If you have one of the other classes, I guess you wouldn't if you're graduate students. But I can answer questions on any of this. Maximilian, to make a long story short, French retreated from Mexico in February of 1867 for a lot of reasons. One of them was that Mexican guerrilla forces never stopped their activities, while the French, meanwhile, had to guard and send reinforcements to their eastern border, facing war against the Prussians, a war which they would eventually lose in 1872. Also, American diplomatic pressure after the end of the Civil War. The Lincoln government sided with Juarez and the Republican liberals. And so there were lots of forces that were against the French occupation of Mexico. So they abandoned Mexico in February of 1867, leading to the execution of Maximilian. This is a sort of a photograph that was so badly taken or so badly frayed in appearance that they had to actually fill in the blanks with sort of paint. So they sort of painted this photograph, which is supposed to be the actual photograph of Maximilian being executed with two of his top generals. And that was in June of 1867, leading to, of course, that's his body there, which the Mexican government didn't want to give up for several months until they finally gave it to the Austrian government in September of 1867. Maximilian's gravesite, or tomb, I guess you would call it, is in Austria to this very day. And there's the shirt by which he was, with which he was executed. So that led to a new era in Mexico. Lots of stories in between there. I don't have time, of course, to go through all of this, and I don't want to confuse anybody, but it did lead to the two most powerful men in Mexico being those two men there. I told you Porfirio Diaz on your left, the most respected military leader in Mexico, and Benito Juarez, who now was the president in 1867 of a unified Mexican republic, which would bring some stability to Mexican politics. And although there would be lots of conflict to go before the end of the 19th century, this brought probably the most stable government that Mexico had known up to this point, because for the first 50-plus years of Mexico's existence, there was a constant state of civil war and insurgencies, leading to a change in government more than 50 times until Juarez became the president of the Mexican Republic in 1867. Juarez passed away in 1872, leaving a power vacuum, as I mentioned in your email. And so that led the presidency, or that provided the path toward the presidency for Porfirio Diaz, who was able to defeat his rivals and become president of Mexico finally in 1877. He would lead into an era of what people call, variously, one scholar calls it a constitutional dictatorship. My preferred term is an authoritarian republic or an authoritarian presidency. Basically, Diaz was the man in charge, even when there was at least one other president who was president, but as a figurehead. The man in charge in Mexico from 1867 until 1911 was Porfirio Diaz. And for most of that, he was the official president of the Mexican Republic. There were good things about this at the beginning. Diaz allowed for freedom of the press at first, of course, like a lot of people do, until they don't like what the press is saying about them. And that describes Porfirio Diaz. And that's where we get into the era of the Mexican Revolution. But before 1910, you have Porfirio Diaz as the leader of the Mexican Republic. There he is as a young man. Was swept into power with the help of American loan of $500,000, mostly from railroad investors who wanted to speculate on the railroad situation in Mexico. There was money to be made, and 800 American mercenaries helped Diaz attain power. Diaz was seen to be the more favorable to American interest over the other rivals, as well as being a very charismatic figure in Mexican politics and among the military. So he was able to attain the presidency by force, By 1867, he actually took over the government 1876, but became in 1877 the official president of the Mexican Republic, which lasted for another 35 years or so, right? So the Mexican economy did see some boom times under Diaz, right, who vanquished his rival Sebastian Lerdo de Tejada. He was not executed. He was actually allowed eventually to live his own life, which he did, who lived to a fairly ripe old age later on. The problem with a lot of this was by the 1890s, the economies all over the world had collapsed with a worldwide depression, leading to the first signs of the cracks in the system established by Diaz. What Diaz essentially did do was establish sort of a nationwide political machine where the governors were beholden to him. If any governor expressed any kind of independence, he was quickly replaced and sent to another governorship across the country, while he would put his own favorite within the governor's seat in that particular state. So he was able to manipulate the state governments to be favorable to him, as well as being the giver of patronage not only to state governments, but his government also was allowed to this umbrella of patronage all over the country, going down to the lowest level, including, as Alan Knight mentions in the book, jefes políticos. You'll see that in the book. Political bosses, all of them all over, perhaps hundreds, perhaps thousands, all over the country, who were beholden to Diaz in one form or the other, but treated their office as their own personal fiefdom. And so the theme of the Porfirio Diaz government was order and progress. It wasn't anything. There was nothing about democracy, but it was everything about republicanism, meaning a republic under the law, which Diaz sought to do, as Juarez, his predecessor, had done before, was to establish the rule of law, meaning anything they wanted to make legal, they took pains to make legal. So Diaz was a legally elected president, and what Diaz and Juarez had done before him was to manipulate both the political system and the system of laws established by the new Republican government of the 1860s to favor Diaz. Juarez began the same sort of process toward presidential authoritarianism before Diaz took over. And Diaz actually correctly spelled with an accent over the I. Of course, I did it wrong here, but he has been made sort of a dictator, a villain in history for this, but he was quite an extraordinary individual, as Benito Juarez was before him. And so the constitutional dictatorship was actually a product of the Juarez years. A liberal government, meaning embarking on free market policies, meaning favorable toward landowners and not favorable to indigenous people and other peasants who had land rights stretching back hundreds of years to the days of the Spanish colonization. So what Diaz started to do was overturn lots of these land rights in favor of local Mexican landowners and a few foreign landowners as well. Diaz left office officially only one time. No one questioned who was in charge even during that time, during the early 1880s, and another president who we don't need to name, but you will see, I think, in your Alan Knight book. So agriculture expanded, especially among Mexican owners and some foreign owners, as I said. The wealth of Mexico, for the first time, oil deposits were discovered, and but all the while foreign powers were able to mine wealth under the oil and mineral deposits, particularly copper, in Mexico, lots of people were also without the sufficient means of support, including peons or peones who were peasants. There were thousands of them in Mexico at the time, because Mexico at the time was not an entirely industrialized nation as it is today. It's entirely an industrialized nation today, but it wasn't back then. And many of the people were left landless under the Diaz administration. Foreigners owned between 14 and 20% of all land, and fewer than 1,000 families controlled most of the rest. 95% of the rural population had none. So all but 10% of the land was out of the hands of indigenous groups and other peasants who collectively owned land, and 90% now, or more than 90%, was now in private hands. Less than 10% of any indigenous communities had any land, whereas that was a change from the days of the Spanish colonization, where many indigenous communities had their own communal lands. Foreign capital represented 97% of investments, 98% of rubber, and 90% of oil. 75% of all profit-generating mines were owned by U.S. interests. By 1900, the United States was the number one investor in Mexico, surpassing Great Britain, who had previously been the number one investor in Mexico from the days of Mexican independence in 1821. By the early 20th century, first of all, the worldwide depression affected Mexico, leaving many more people without sufficient means of support, and worker unrest and union activity was met with force, sometimes by foreign agents who were given permission by the Diaz government to fire on striking workers, most notoriously at a place called Cananea across the Arizona border, which Alan Knight, I believe, also mentions. 1906 miners' strike, where Mexican workers were massacred by both the Mexican and foreign security officers, including Americans, which was not looked at favorably by the Mexican population, because Diaz began to look not only as a tyrant but as a traitor as well to many Mexicans. Early opposition, again mentioned by Alan Knight, the Flores Magón brothers, among the most radical of the opposition leaders against Diaz, Jesus and Enrique Flores Magón, and the publishers. They were the publishers of the newspaper Regeneración, and they were eventually driven out of Mexico and also hounded by the American government because they became involved in American union activities. One of them eventually died in prison. They are significant in that they were the early radical opposition to Diaz in the early part of the 20th century. Diaz actually followed the philosophy of this man economically, José Yves Limantour, born of French parents, but was a Mexican citizen, born in Mexico, and his architect, the chief architect of scientific policies, influenced by Herbert Spencer's imperialism, or scientific racism, as we call it, of the late 19th century, and the philosophy of positivism out of France, using that to justify the concentration of wealth and the neglect of Mexican workers, and especially Mexican peasants, and especially the Mexican indigenous populations. By 1900, Porfirio Diaz had actually helped to engineer the first monetary surplus in Mexico's history. So the budget of Mexico actually saw a surplus for the first time by 1900, whereas before that Mexico had many times been completely without funding at the federal government level. And so that was a chronic problem until the era of Diaz. So Diaz did bring a measure of wealth to Mexico, greatly expanded the railroads until by 1910 there were 10,000 miles of railroad. That's dwarfed in comparison to the railroads in the United States, but that's very significant by Latin American standards. So on paper, Porfirio Diaz looked like the miracle worker of the Mexican economy, but below the surface was bubbling lots of anger because lots and lots of people were left out of those benefits. Sound familiar? Anyway, I just wanted to show you these pictures of the Mexican border, I guess now, and that's one of the areas of the fencing. And this is the Mexican border back then, meaning it was like a post that said United States and Mexico. This is going to be significant for a lot of reasons. A lot of the opposition to Diaz, when they felt being jailed or arrested, would actually cross the border. And many of them congregated in San Antonio, which became a center of Mexican revolutionary and opposition activity. And they would go back and forth many times. And that's one thing we'll keep in mind as we go forward with this story, right? Another thing Diaz did was bring classic European architecture to Mexico City. The Diaz regime wanted to make Mexico into a little French republic, emulating France and the Western world in general by their model of the model of liberal republicanism and progress represented by the Western world, particularly France. Diaz wanted to bring that to Mexico, so he brought classic European architecture influenced by Mexican styles to Mexico City. This is the Palace of Fine Arts, a very impressive structure that also houses many works of art and murals, a very interesting place to visit as well. Porfirio Diaz revived the memory of his old rival, Benito Juarez, because when Diaz started facing criticism in the 1890s, actually diverted attention by propping up the memory of Juarez, who he at one time hated. Now he's building a monument to Juarez with the Lady Liberty standing above him, like shining her torch, the symbol of liberal republicanism. And so that was. He also commissioned some very substantial volumes of Juarez biographies by the late 1890s. So the Juarez memory was revived by Diaz, and today Juarez remains a national hero, whereas Diaz is not, although his own memory has been revived somewhat by scholars in Mexico. This is another picture that represents the Mexico of Diaz, the urban centers of Mexico, Mexico City and other urban centers, and including the Oaxaca City in Diaz's home state, were models of urban living with public utilities and public power and public and modern architecture. They were models of urban life that could rival any, even in Europe and the United States. And these are the men of the Diaz regime surveying some territory there from the top of the government palace. You can see the Mexican cathedral in the background, built by the middle of the 16th century. So these are the old Mexico and the new modern Mexico that Diaz and the people around Diaz prided themselves on, bringing Mexico into the modern world at the expense, of course, of the peasantry and at the expense of political participation, because, of course, even among middle class and wealthier people who wished to participate in the political process, if you did not have the right connections, that was not good, because the Diaz regime became a political machine by 1900. It was who you knew, not what you knew. And so not only was this problematic for the population of Mexico, it's problematic because Diaz has also managed to alienate the wealthier and middle-class segments of Mexican society, along with the peasantry and along with industrial workers in the urban centers of Mexico, right? So these various forces are going to be bubbling to the surface, as you will read in the Alan Knight books and in the Alan Knight volumes. Alan Knight does a very good job of presenting the revolution on a very small local scale. It was not just Pancho Villa or Emiliano Zapata who were leaders of this revolution. There were Mexican revolutionary leaders that were going to pop up all over the place because of these disparate elements of inequality and a lack of political participation in Mexico. So you have authoritarian government plus very strong class divisions, as John Mason Hart likes to point out, and very strong inequalities in opportunity and in wealth. These are the things that are going to bring Diaz down, and it's going to be your job to interpret Alan Knight's take on the revolution, as well as his chief rival, John Mason Hart, who has a more Marxist take on it, and you'll look at that coming up. Oh, this is a cartoon from one of the American newspapers summing up the situation in Mexico, which has been oversimplified by scholars, or especially early on. We now know the Mexican Revolution as a very complicated affair that can't strictly be defined in terms of class. Although John Mason Hart makes a very good case for that. It is the Mexican Revolution, regardless of what Knight and Hart both say, is a very complicated affair. Whose questions, or the questions revolving around the revolution, many of them still have yet to be answered because it is that complicated. These are scenes from Mexican life of the early 20th century, and for this lecture particularly, we'll be talking about the Volume 1. He's going to stop somewhere right before the revolution really flames up into like a sort of countrywide affair with various factions battling for power. But that's a story we can hold for the next time. Pulqueria, pulque, the traditional liquor, alcoholic beverage of indigenous groups like the Aztecs before the Spanish arrived. Now it's become very popular as a national drink of Mexico, still available in Mexico. Very good stuff, especially the flavored pulque. These are the many sides of Mexico, a pulque that caters to a much poorer crowd. This is sort of a middle class, middle sector, ranchero crowd, and you have the peasant crowd here in this pulqueria. This is a reading room in Mexico City where people could go and read newspapers. Mexico City's literate population was growing before the revolution. Urban Mexico suffered much less under Diaz than rural Mexico, and you'll be seeing that as we go along too. So there's Porfirio Diaz visiting with William Howard Taft, the first president to actually visit Mexican soil. This was, I think, 1908, somewhere around there. The beginning of the end for many scholars and storytellers of the Mexican Revolution begins with the Mexican Independence Centennial celebration in September 16th, or the week of September 16th in 1910, where dignitaries from Europe and the United States converged on Mexico, as well as a detachment of German military officers, right? You have a procession there that's supposed to represent an Aztec procession. So you see that Diaz was able to recruit indigenous peoples and dress them like Aztecs, including your Aztec emperor or Tlatoani. So this is all representation. Indigenous people by this time did not really dress that way, but it was for show. And it was a very large and very impressive celebration also, but it meant to a lot of people afterward that was the beginning of the end, because that's basically the year of the revolution. That very same year, people saw Halley's Comet from Mexico, and that was also among Mexicans culturally a very bad omen. Another picture of Diaz with his wife there, and you got the German officers there, and you have your other contingent of Porfirian officials. That's the Porfirio Diaz's Mexico as I envision it, in their top hats and their frock coats and high collars, right? Very representative of Diaz at the time and the Diaz regime. These are other scenes from this is Cinco de Mayo celebration, Mexico City around that same time. Very happy times. This is a phonograph recording of Porfirio Diaz's voice, the gift given by Thomas Alva Edison. The voice you hear right now is the voice of Porfirio Diaz. He sounds exactly like my father-in-law. But you see that Diaz was not somebody given to speeches. He did not have a booming speaking voice. It might even have been uncomfortable in public. He was content to be the presidential, the presidente, or the authoritarian president through much quieter means, mostly out of the spotlight, except for special occasions, was not given to fancy sort of Fidel Castro-like speeches. As you can hear from this, was not the greatest speaker in the world. Diaz was about 79 years old when he gave this recording here. So that's the problem with the whole thing. An aging Diaz and a very anxious population as to what would happen when the older man finally would pass away. Because Diaz is the glue that's holding a lot of the elements of Mexico together by 1910. And there he is congratulating Edison on his great invention, which will be a benefactor to all of humanity. And he gives a very long speech of gratitude to Thomas Alva Edison for sending him that phonograph recorder. He's talking about, the new electric technology. and congratulating him there. You will see Bernardo Reyes in your Ellen Knight book, because Bernardo Reyes was a very respected military officer in northern Mexico and very charismatic, whom people thought they could promote as the vice president to Diaz. The anxiety was that if Diaz passes away, they want somebody solid and charismatic enough to hold Mexico together. So they pushed Bernardo Reyes as the official vice president, and there were clubs that formed in Mexico to promote the vice presidential candidacy of Bernardo Reyes. Diaz actually never picked him as his vice president, and Bernardo Reyes never advertised himself as vice president. These were just the hopeful pro-Diaz political factions that wanted a peaceful transition if Diaz, in fact, did pass away, since he was approaching the age of 80. And in 1910, that is very, very old. Diaz, in an interview with an American journalist, did say he would step down in 1908, and that got the ball rolling. People hopeful that Bernardo Reyes or somebody else could succeed Diaz, or that Diaz would actually step down for elections, as he told this journalist. When the election time rolled around toward 1910, Diaz changed his mind, decided he would run again as the only candidate for president as he had done in the past, leading for this young 38 or 35-ish year old landowning man from northern Mexico, from a landowning family in Coahuila. You will see that in your book, Francisco I. Madero, who was only about 5'2", good at riding horses, being a rural landowner, also a kind of man who might have made a good professor, did not make a very good president of Mexico. He actually called for effective suffrage, no re-election, and wrote a book called The Presidential Succession, in which he argued for free elections. And that actually became one of the rallying points of the revolution. Francisco Madero did run for president against Diaz. He was quickly imprisoned, jailed, for being a candidate for the Mexican presidency. And Diaz actually, no surprise probably, won that election with very few votes going to Madero. Madero eventually escaped, went to San Antonio, and declared for a revolution by November 20th, 1910, which kind of by this time you had many groups out there maybe wanting to become engaged in an armed revolution. They weren't doing it, but this man, when he publicly said this, and these things were repeated all throughout Mexico, reprinted in newspapers, posted on publicly. These were reverberating throughout Mexico by various means, people reading them, reading Madero's declaration to other Mexicans who couldn't read, and then you had, all of a sudden, Viva Madero! Viva la Revolucion! And that's where this revolution erupted after November 20th, 1910. You see all these disparate groups all over the country would arm themselves. These particular men are adherents of Pancho Villa, part of Pancho Villa's revolutionary army, and you'll know about him in your book as well. Pancho Villa, as a 15-year-old peasant in northern Mexico, actually shot the nephew of a landowner in the foot. The nephew had approached his sister with an indecent proposal. Francisco Villa, his name at the time, Doroteo Arango, his birth name, shot him in the foot, and thereafter remained a fugitive after the age of 15, became an expert horseman, was never technically a bandit, as he's actually portrayed, but he was engaged in probably nefarious activities like buying stolen cattle, stuff like that. He was also proprietor of many businesses in northern Mexico. He was a man of the border, meaning he was one tough hombre, I guess you would say, one tough character, expert marksman, expert with a horse, was very, very keen on personal relationships, meaning he could kill somebody at the drop of a hat. At the same time, he could forgive somebody at the drop of a hat. He could even cry a few tears here and there. Never smoked, well, once in a while might have smoked cigarettes or cigars. Never touched alcohol. Was not a drinker. He liked peanut brittle. Actually, when he went to go meet with other revolutionary factions in San Antonio, as they would be plotting the revolution, he'd actually have pocketfuls of peanut brittle that he would eat while people were drinking their booze. And here are some of his lieutenants you will see. He had some of them, Rudolfo Fierro on the left, a cold-blooded killer, And then you have someone who was a member of Porfirio Diaz's army, an officer in that army, an officer and a gentleman named Felipe Angeles, who was in charge of Pancho Villa's artillery. So you'd have lots of colorful characters, right? Their base of operations, Villa was from Durango. That's Chihuahua, Mexico. That's in the red, so that's just north of Durango. That becomes Villa's base of operations, right? You have Emiliano Zapata, whose revolution actually started before November, when he and a group of peasants from his hometown of Anenequilco, Morelos, Mexico, which is just south of Mexico City. His village actually, by force, took some land that federal soldiers or federal landowners were starting to take over with the help of federal soldiers under Diaz. Zapata and his his group of peasants actually forcibly made the federal troops leave and took over that patch of land. So he predates the revolution because this happened before November. Emiliano Zapata was I guess you would call him an elite peasant, a leader among his people, an expert horseman as well, an expert shot, also had spent some time in the Mexican military, well respected and chosen unanimously as the leader of the Morelos or of the opposition from his village. So that's what started that revolution, or that side of the revolution. There will be two main factions. They'll be from the north and from the south. Emiliano Zapata represents the southern faction, very different from Villa's army, which attracted all kinds of characters of all rustlers and shop owners and indigenous peoples, but all kinds of different factions into this enormous army that became 40,000 people under Pancho Villa. Zapata's army was basically a peasant army, much more conservative in nature than Villa's army, and Emiliano Zapata himself was not given to talking much. As it said, you'll read the book by Womack later about Zapata. He was quiet already, and when he drank, he tended to get quieter. And Zapata did like to drink. Very different from Villa, a very boisterous individual, laughed. You could see the sort of crow's feet on his eyes because he laughed a lot. Ha, 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 and talked and could be, very talkative, a great dancer, the whole thing. Zapata, by comparison, much more reserved. These are the most well-known of the revolutionary officers. Zapata's own army was 25,000. There's going to be lots more all over who did not have any particular affiliation. You will see that with Alan Knight's book. And there Zapata was with his own men, a colorful cast of characters. Manuel Palafox, who became, he had been a clerk of some kind, had been somewhat college educated, who was actually more of a socialist, became the official ideologue behind the Zapatista movement. Zapatista was himself not communist or socialist, or pretty apolitical in that way. He just wanted land for his people. That was the central sort of thrust of Zapata's plan, which he called the Plan de Ayala, right? So that was basically a plan calling for the return of the land to peasants from which it had been stolen. That's Emiliano Zapata's revolution, right? And that's the state of Morelos, by comparison, very tiny. When you read the monograph on Zapata by Womack later on, you'll see that Morelos, a very tiny place of traditional peasant communities, was overwhelmed with Mexican landowners who had taken over and put into private hands all the other land that had been communal. And so you will look at that later on with that monograph, right? Another revolutionary leader, Pascual Orozco from northern Mexico, a former barber, and I guess basically you could say a middle-class businessman who leads his own army of revolution and is responsible for a lot of victories early on in the revolution that forced Porfirio Diaz to leave Mexico in March of 1911. The saying, according to legend, he said when he was leaving and boarding that ship for France, where he would die about 4 or 5 years later, Porfirio Diaz said, "Poor Mexico, so close to the United States and so far from God." That's what he said. But more accurately, what he said about Madero, since Madero was going to assume the presidency when Diaz fled the country, he said, "Madero has inherited a tiger. Let's see if he could tame him." And that is going to be a tiger. Madero assumes power in October of 1911 with an overwhelming vote of the people, probably up to that time among the fairest votes ever cast in a Mexican election. He becomes the president of Mexico, the new Mexican Republic. The problem with Madero was he did not believe necessarily in land rights for the peasantry. He did believe in democracy, and he believed with the ouster of Diaz and the institution of a democratic republic, all would be well with Mexico. But he was dead wrong. There was a rebellion that broke out within a year. Was it a year? Within 2 years, a little less than 2 years, a rebellion broke out by former officers in the Porfirio Diaz Federal Army, including led by his nephew Felix Diaz. Right, so Madero sent his top general to put down that rebellion. There's Felix Diaz right there. It's called the 10 Tragic Days of Mexico City, where many people, including civilians and horses, were killed. And you'd see bodies in the center of Mexico because of this battle that broke out between the rebellious faction and the Mexican federal forces, now under Madero. And there's the Zócalo, the middle of Mexico City. That's the central plaza, the Zócalo, Z-O-C-A with an accent, L-O. Another picture there, you see dead people, dead horses, as a result of that rebellion. Madero sent his officer-in-chief, the chief commander of the Federal Army, Victoriano Huerta, who was of mostly indigenous stock, although he was culturally Hispanic, meaning Spanish-speaking. Victoriano Huerta was also rumored to be sort of a lover of marijuana, and especially a lover of booze. The song La Cucaracha, which references a cockroach that can only function while smoking marijuana, that was a song that was sung by Pancho Villa's troops, and it was about Victoriano Huerta. Victoriano Huerta actually entered into a truce with Felix Diaz, and their agreement was actually secretly signed that they would take over the government. Francisco Madero was arrested while presiding over a meeting and under house arrest for a time before being sent to the what was then the very imposing structure meant for political prisoners under Diaz. Today, it houses the Mexican National Archive. And those are the bars that exist today on the side of on the sidewalk there. So it's meant to look dramatic, this picture. Madero and his vice president, Pino Suarez, while they were being led into the prison, actually were assassinated. And so Huerta became the president, and as Alan Knight does show you in his book, he became one of the most brutal military dictators in the history of Latin America. There's an inside shot of the prison at the time. Today, those rooms there house various archives. And there's the news. The Mexico City press was a thriving press. They wrote all about this stuff. Reporters discovered the bodies of Madero and his vice president, Pino Suarez, and these are one of the newspaper headlines: tragic death of Don Francisco I. Madero and Don Jose Maria Pino Suarez. Gustavo Madero, who advised his brother as president to get rid of the Diaz government officials because they'd plot against him, himself was murdered. His eye was gouged out by the soldiers under Felix Diaz, right? So the mistake of Madero was in not changing the government. He actually demanded also and asked for and got his own troops, his grassroots troops, to disarm themselves because he believed by keeping the federal army intact, by keeping the Diaz government intact, but instituting a democratic government, all would be well. But it wasn't, because as soon as he was president, the plot started against him, leading to his death and the death of his brother. So now you have a military dictatorship under Victoriano Huerta. The old allies of Diaz were rejoicing, and including the ambassador to Mexico, Henry Lane Wilson, who encouraged Huerta to overthrow Madero and promised U.S. support. The bad thing for Henry Lane Wilson is the next president is going to be Woodrow Wilson, who did not like this situation since Wilson ideologically believed in the idea of democracy and quickly removed Henry Lane Wilson from his post, replacing him with William Jennings Bryan, if you remember him of Cross of Gold speech fame. But I think you will see that also in the book. With the dictatorship of Huerta, then you had Venustiano Carranza became the first chief of the Constitutionalist Revolutionary Army, called for a backlash revolution against Huerta. So he, from his perch in the state of Coahuila, announced for a revolution against Juarez. And that got the ball rolling, because that's going to lead eventually to the ouster of Juarez. But I guess we could stop our little talk here at this point, and I could give you the other half of this in a few weeks. I will be leaving the state for about a week and a half. I believe the first volume ends with the death of Madero. So right here we're ending with the revolution as declared by Venustiano Carranza of the state of Coahuila, who is a landowner himself from the same state as Madero, a very towering man, 6'5", of very wealthy sensibilities, who was, you will see, going to be in conflict with some of his allies who are not of such sensibilities. But we will be talking about that coming up. What I wanted to mention now is, let's see if we can take this off, or maybe not. Well, what I wanted to mention now was what's going to be due in the next week. So you will be discussing Volume 1. You don't have to write about it yet. So by Monday, I'm going to change the due dates. I'm going to make it by midnight Monday, where I would want you to make your comment of no less than 250 words, and also to present a question of either of content or methodology that I expect other people will respond to. I will require you to write this posting, your 250-word response to that reading, as well as your question, and then respond to the question of another student by midnight on Monday. When is that? June 7th, 8th, 9th? June 10th. I guess that's what it says there. So yes. And then after that, I'll have you write the full review of the book, including Volume 2. But in the interim, this is how the schedule will go. So you write your comments for Monday at midnight. A few days later, I will have you discuss. No, not yet. That's not coming up, so don't worry about that. So on the following Friday, by midnight, I'll have you also post a discussion comment of 250 words along with your question and along with the response to another student's question. But also, I will expect you to have your book review ready by midnight also on Friday. So by midnight Friday, you will write your book review on these two volumes, Volume 1 and Volume 2 of Alan Knight's The Mexican Revolution. And also Friday, I'll have you post your 250-word discussion along with your question and a response to other student, all by midnight on Friday. So by midnight Monday, you'll be just discussion only for Volume 1 under those guidelines, and then by Friday you'll have your book review, and you will also have your further discussion on Volume 2. So that's what I will expect by over the next week, Monday and Wednesday. And don't worry about the other week from right now. Well, you will see, and I'll talk about this. The next assignment after that, the following, when will that be? The 17th, 18th, 19th, I'll have you discuss the two academic articles I have posted there. I can give you more information on that, but for right now, just work on the volumes there, the discussion and the discussion comments due by midnight. Also, your discussion comments and response by midnight on Monday, the next Monday. But also, and that's Volume 1, Friday, your discussion and comments and questions and your book review of Volumes 1 and 2 by Friday, the following Friday, not this Friday, the following Friday, which is going to be June 14th. And I'll go ahead and update the D2L if I have some incorrections there. But once again, both things will be due by midnight on those days. Once again, Monday, midnight, comments, questions, respond to questions. Friday will be comments, questions, response to questions, and your book review by Friday the 14th at midnight. And then I'll give you some further instructions on the discussion immediately after that on the academic articles, which I have posted there in D2L. If you have any questions, class, just let me know. I'll be happy to answer any. Well, I'll have a second part of this lecture when I get back from well, this should prepare you for the Volume 1 anyway. In Volume 2, as we go along, you'll see how the revolution erupts into something much greater. But for right now, I think this is enough to get you going on that. What it's going to turn into is a three-way war, a three-way civil war involving the factions, including General Alvaro Obregón, who is the general for Carranza, but also these three individuals here. Emiliano Zapata, Pancho Villa, and Venustiano Carranza are going to be fighting each other. Zapata and Pancho Villa on one side, and Carranza and his top general, Alvaro Obregón, on the other. And that's the two of them right there. So that will be in Volume 2, but I believe I've given you hopefully enough information to get you started. If you have any questions on that, I'll be talking to you through email if you need to, and I'll be also sending any updates I might need to do over the next week or so. If you do want me to, if you want to send me an email, if you would like another presentation based on the second half of the revolution, which I did plan to do anyway, but let me know how you feel about that if you care to send me an email. But I won't be able to do that for a few weeks. So just remember, just your assignments in Volume 1 and Volume 2 over the next week or so. So I will be talking to you hopefully shortly. Good luck, students. I will be responding or keeping my eye out for your emails. Thanks.